I have a how to describe this segment. So I used to do a little segment at the top of the show called Road to the Stage,
Hmm.
documenting my weight loss progress. And I recently ticked off a nice little milestone. I am officially below 220 for the first time since August of 2012, I believe. So that's good.
Yeah.
Feeling good.
Awesome.
Quite happy about that. And so I wanted to do a little segment talking a little bit about some of the things that have helped me out along the way with that process, because I've quite publicly been a larger man in the public eye for over a decade at this point, and have quite publicly struggled with weight loss in the past, um, and a good chunk of my ongoing success this time around has been in, so one of the frequent things that I would see said about me on the internet previously was, why should I listen to anything that this person has to say about nutrition if clearly just looking at them they don't know anything about it, like don't know what they're doing, which, like, honestly, I get it. It is what it is. But a lot of the journey to where I'm at now, I think a lot of what has helped me is not so much like learning new things about weight loss. It has been unlearning things that I used to think were like absolutely necessary and mandatory. Um, that in a lot of contexts are probably good advice, but that when applied without care and context can, I think, sometimes do more harm than good. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit in this segment. So yeah, the title I have for it is Popular Weight Loss Advice That May Do More Harm Than Good. And just to add a little nuance to that, uh, you know, things that are probably in a vacuum pretty decent advice, but can that have a non-trivial risk of leading people astray when applied without context. And so, to be clear, I'm not talking about like scams or like fad diets or anything like that. Um,
You're not gonna do a whole segment on the grapefruit diet here?
Correct. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm talking about things that are the sort of advice you would hear from generally well-informed and well-intentioned evidence-based fitness professionals that, like I said, in a vacuum might be very good advice, but that I think are sometimes presented as blanket must-haves that might not always be the case. So I think I think what I'm getting at will become more clear as I get into this segment. Um, and also, so just to kind of start out with some context and background for where a lot of the dietary advice in the like so-called evidence-based fitness community originates, and I mean really just the broader fitness community in general. Um, a lot of it kind of originates with or gets popular with bodybuilders and physique athletes first and foremost, which kind of makes sense. So for people who are bodybuilders, physique athletes, like a huge part of the sport is pursuing what Adam Fisher, our buddy Adam, does support for both Stronger by Science and Macro Factor. Great dude, got absolutely diced in this past year. But what he terms exotic levels of leanness. And if that is your pursuit, if a big part of your sport is just getting as peeled as you can possibly get, it makes sense that you're more likely than the average person to just like stew on the approaches that might be best suited to accomplishing that pursuit, because that's a huge part of your sport. And when you're trying to reach an extreme goal, the details simply matter more. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I also think it makes a lot of sense for just kind of the general fitness public to look towards bodybuilders, physique athletes, bodybuilding coaches, physique coaches for general nutrition advice. You know, even if like there are reasons you might not want to, but just kind of like on a very basic level, it makes sense because, you know, if you're like, that is a population of people who reliably and predictably achieve extreme levels of leanness. Like, that's a huge part of what they do. And it's pretty rare for successful bodybuilders to sign up for a show and just show up completely out of shape. You know, they're able to pick months in advance. Hey, I'm doing a show on this date and I need to be incredibly lean by that date. And then they get there. And I think that that's extremely appealing for a lot of people because, you know, the thought process is if they can so reliably and predictably get that lean, and I have, you know, I'm only trying to get down to 15% body fat, or like for the women listening, like, you know, 25% body fat, something like that. Like if they can get that peeled, then their advice certainly has to be good enough to help me get to where I'm trying to go on a reasonable timeline, you know?
Yeah, and we see that with other domains as well, where like you'll see people who are like trying to get tips for running their like one person sole proprietorship type business, and they're like, I'm going to read a book by someone who runs a Fortune 500 company with like 70,000 employees about how to manage a company. And it's like, well, yeah, like those strategies certainly can help you manage an enormous company, but you might not necessarily need that for your sole proprietorship or for like a tiny business that has like 2 contractors.
Yeah, for sure. So, a point that I'm going to attempt to make in this segment is that some of that advice might be unnecessary at best or counterproductive at worst for people who aren't pursuing as extreme of goals. And just as one final like little bit of framing before diving in, the context of this segment is I'm talking about people who are trying to lose a significant amount of weight and keep it off. So I'm not necessarily talking about advice for people who are going into a weight loss attempt with the intention of kind of doing cyclical bulks and cuts. You know, you're going to lose 20 pounds, trying to get super lean, and then you're going to regain 20, 30 pounds in the off season to try to build more muscle and then get lean again. You know, like which I'll note, like, that's also like a kind of common piece of advice a lot of people give, which also just directly comes from bodybuilders, which I don't know if that's necessary for everyone. But people with those sort of who are intending to take a cyclical approach to weight management, that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about folks who are trying to lose, you know, 10, 20, 30 pounds and keep it off in perpetuity.
Yep.
So with that out of the way, let's dive in. So ultimately, I think a successful weight loss diet, kind of for that purpose, lose the weight and keep it off, is going to need to have 3 characteristics. One, you need to be able to stick to it to help you stay in an energy deficit for a long enough period of time to lose the weight you want to lose. Number 2, it needs to support other goals you have beyond weight loss per se. You know, like if you're working out, you need to have energy for working out. Trying to maintain muscle, you need to be able to maintain muscle. Needs to be able to gel with your social life to some extent. All of those things. And number 3, and perhaps most importantly, certainly very important, whatever you do needs to set you up for success at the end of your diet. Because again, you're trying to lose the weight and keep it off. So it's not just, you know, trying to sprint to lose 20 pounds and then you just find yourself on kind of the yo-yo diet roller coaster, lose the weight, gain it all back. You want to be able to build the necessary skills and lifestyle around what you're doing, that when you lose weight, you'll be able to maintain that and keep it off. So the first idea I would like to talk about, the first piece of popular advice that I think often might be okay advice in a vacuum, but that often does more harm than good when just given as blanket advice to everyone, is the pursuit of rigid macro counting. And I'm not going to get super in depth on this because I know you've talked about this on the podcast quite a bit before, but I'll note on the front end that a rigid approach to macro counting makes a lot of sense for bodybuilders in a lot of contexts. So first, the general rigidity of it. Having carb, fat, protein targets that you try to stick to every day with minimal or ideally no deviations from them. That makes a lot of sense when you're on a strict timeline where you need to get super diced for a show on a particular date.
Yeah.
There is an end date for that diet, and you better get there. Otherwise, there's not much room for error, and you just kind of make a fool of yourself on stage. Which, that's not what you're doing, So
Yeah.
The rigidity, like a rigid approach to macro counting, can certainly make a lot of sense for bodybuilders from that perspective. And also just the approach to macro counting in particular. So, not just trying to keep an eye on, say, total calorie and protein intake, but really trying to keep an eye on each particular macronutrient, having carb targets for the day, fat targets for the day, and really not trying to deviate from them much at all. I also think that makes a lot of sense for specifically bodybuilders trying to get super lean. So protein, obvious, that's going to help support muscle maintenance, or maybe even gaining a little bit at the start of the diet. Need to have plenty of protein. Fat makes sense, like having a strict fat target. Fat's important for absorbing fat-soluble vitamins, maintaining hormone production, etc. Carb intake, also very important. You need energy to fuel your training. And the thing is, if someone is pursuing exotic levels of leanness, you find yourself with very little margin for error at the end of a diet. Like, you're not going to be eating as much of anything as you would like to, but you might be dealing with something where if you don't hit, like, your fat target is really low, your carb target is really low, and if you eat 10 more grams of fat than you had allotted for yourself, well, now carb intake is so low that your already shitty training session is just going to be even shittier, or
what's that saying? Is it robbing Peter to pay Paul?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. When you're dieting in a bodybuilding context, toward the end, every time you add one macro, you're like, I'm paying for this somewhere else.
Yeah. Exactly. And the inverse as well. Like if you eat 30 more grams of carbs than you were supposed to, and that comes out of your fat budget, you might be looking at weeks at a time where you're really consuming such low fat intake that it's quite unhealthy.
Yeah.
So the really, really strict approach to macro counting and really focusing on each macro makes a lot of sense in that context. But I think that can be counterproductive for a lot of folks who have other goals beyond just getting diced for a bodybuilding show. First, it's just generally unnecessary. Like our general perspective is that for most people, just tracking protein and total calories is fine. Most people's hedonic preferences will wind them up with enough fat intake to support fat-soluble vitamin absorption, hormone production, enough carb intake to support training. And, you're not going to be finding yourself in the sort of situation where everything is just so low that those trade-offs get really extreme. Also, like the idea of really rigid macro counting, you've talked about this a lot before, the difference between rigid and flexible cognitive restraint. A lot of people refer to all macro counting approaches as flexible dieting because you have a lot of flexibility with food choice. But if you're, if you're pursuing 3 numbers that you have to hit every day with very, very little room for error, that just gives you a lot more opportunities to fail. and lose motivation. And an in-depth discussion of maintaining motivation over the course of an entire diet, that's probably a little bit outside the scope of this segment. But just in kind of broad terms, if you're setting goals for yourself that are challenging but achievable and you're hitting them consistently, that can help build and sustain motivation as you move forward. But, if you're putting yourself in a situation where you're setting goals and targets for yourself that aren't strictly necessary for the pursuit of your goal, and you're giving yourself more opportunities to at least perceive what you're doing to be failing, if you're saying, man, I got to get within 10 grams of my carb target and 5 grams of my fat target every day while maintaining some semblance of a normal life, that's going to be quite challenging. A lot of people who aren't, pursuing a diet with the single-minded focus of a bodybuilder, like a lot of times you're just not going to do that. And then you feel like a failure. And then you might hit the kind of fuck it point and say, well, I already went 10 grams over on my fat. Today's already a failure. So I'm just going to eat everything in sight because I already failed today. Like that's the situation you can find yourself with really rigid cognitive restraint. And it's just not necessary.
Yeah, I think the term you used there was the fuck it point.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the research I've seen the what the hell effect, and I'm wondering why they went with that one instead of your preferred version.
I mean, the similar connotations, I would say.
No, it's exactly the same thing, but one is more printable in textbooks.
Yes. And then finally, so with kind of the framing device, 3 things for an important diet: you can stick to it, supports your goals beyond weight loss per se, and sets you up for success at the end of your diet. I don't know that losing weight with really, really rigid macro counting necessarily does a great job of setting people up for success at the end of their diet, because it does take really rigid cognitive restraint to do it. And most people don't want to do that forever. If you're able to pull it off for 16 weeks, 6 months, whatever, you might very successfully lose the weight that you're trying to lose. But most people don't want to come within 5 grams of a protein, carb, and fat target every single day for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
So if that does sound like something that you would enthusiastically do for the next 50 years, then go for it. But if you look at that and say, damn, I really don't want to do that every day for the next 50 years, then this might be an approach to weight loss that ultimately isn't setting you up for long-term success, because it's not the skills you're developing to pursue that type of diet aren't the skills you would need to then be able to kind of transition to a more normal way of eating and ultimately keep the weight off.
Yeah, if I could add a couple things here.
Yeah, go for it.
Number one, you mentioned that a really in-depth discussion of meeting goals and supporting or facilitating motivation, sustained motivation, is a little bit outside the scope of this particular segment. There's 2 articles I would direct readers to. One is strongerbyScience.com/goal setting, and the other is macrofactorapp.com/cheat meals. Both of those go into more detail about sustaining motivation, motivational collapse in the context of overeating, and rigid dietary targets and things like that. So I would recommend that for further detail if anyone's interested. Another thing, I think a lot of people might be confused when they hear this and say, okay, well, I've looked at the literature and it says that for long-term weight loss success, some form of dietary tracking and just general monitoring practices seem to be correlated with success in the long run. And so people might be hearing this and saying, well, what gives? If monitoring is facilitating long-term success, why would very precise monitoring be perhaps not the best approach? And ultimately, I think if I could draw on an anecdote, I was helping out with a study where that was a collaboration with a weight loss clinic. And we would have basically participants would come back when they hit a certain marker, when they kind of hit the next milestone in their weight loss. And it was starting to become really clear the people that were like cruising through it and the people that were really struggling. And, as a researcher, you're in the room with them, right? You have the opportunity to chat, make some small talk, and kind of pick their brain a little bit. And one of the things that jumped out to me was the really successful people who were cruising through it and maintaining it long term. They were doing a lot of the basic monitoring practices that we talk about. They were keeping an eye on body weight, and they were tracking consistently, but not rigidly. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the big distinction that you're getting at here is you want to track consistently, but you don't want to be super rigid about hitting 3 exact numbers precisely for the rest of your life. And when I talk with these folks, what they seem to do, broadly speaking, is fall into a comfortable pattern where they're consistently checking in on body weight, not hyper fixated on it, but just keeping an eye on it, and they are tracking their calories, maybe tracking protein as well. This population wasn't doing a lot of lifting, so the protein was kind of secondary.
Yeah.
But what would happen is if they started to see weight creeping up a little bit, then they would say, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I need to tighten up my tracking a little, and get it from kind of cruise control into like, hey, it looks like things are starting to drift a little bit. I'm aware of that early because I've been monitoring body weight. And now I can take my tracking precision from a 7 out of 10 to an 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10. And for most applications, you really don't have to crank into that absolute highest gear where you're precisely and rigidly tracking carbohydrate and fat and protein, unless you're trying to get to that term you've been using of exotically lean.
Yeah. And also, I mean, like, unless there's a date at which you have to achieve a certain body weight or a certain physique or anything like that, even just like adherence to the targets is more of like a fuzzy concept instead of just like you have to hit the numbers dead on the head every day. So like, as an example, if someone's trying to lose about a pound a week, give or take, that's going to come with an energy deficit of around 500 calories per day on average or so. And so ultimately, if you say need to lose exactly 20 pounds in 20 weeks to get to, whatever physique you're trying to achieve for a bodybuilding show, then like, yeah, you need to achieve that deficit every single day or that cumulative deficit every single week to get where you're trying to go at the exact date you need to get there. If if it's more about long-term weight loss and hey, like what, I'm going to get there eventually and then I'm going to try to stay here and maintain it for the next 20 years or whatever. That's just unnecessary.
Yeah.
If there's a day or two a week where you just say, you know what, there's a lot of other things going on. I have a social event coming up. I just don't feel like being in a deficit today. You can just eat at your maintenance intake, like 1 or 2 days per week. For the week, you're still in a cumulative energy deficit. It's still going to be moving you towards your goal. Maybe not at your intended rate, but it's still ultimately progress, or this is also something I see a lot just when people discuss this on the internet where, maybe their daily calorie target, like even if they're not tracking macros super rigidly, their daily calorie target is like 1,700 calories or something. They're trying to lose a pound a week. And they're like, man, like I hit 1,800 calories today. I hit 1,900 calories today. I feel like a failure. But it's like, dude, like that's still a 300-400 calorie deficit. Like that is still a directionally appropriate thing you did. And I think that if folks were able to take a step back and, adopt a mindset of flexible restraint instead of rigid restraint, that they would see that is still a win. Like this was still a very good day. Perhaps not the absolute optimal conceivable day given what I'm trying to do and the rate I'm trying to do it at, but it's still good. And I think with the really, really rigid restraint, you find yourself in a situation where you end up reframing small wins into unqualified losses, and that is not a recipe for success.
No, I mean that's a great example, and it reminds me. One time I was working with a client, and there was just stuff going on in life where really meticulous tracking and pushing the deficit hard just wasn't really in the cards for a stretch of time. And I could tell they were starting to get a little bit disappointed with some of the, they're like, I haven't been losing weight lately, but weight loss was the goal. And it was starting to kind of get internally framed mentally as failure.
Mm-hmm.
And my biggest thing was like, well, wait a minute, let's take a step back. We're like 17 kilograms below where we started.
Yeah.
Maintaining your weight 17 kilograms below where we started is an unqualified success.
Yeah.
So like, even if you do run into those areas of friction, I know we're talking about a slightly different thing here in terms of timescales, but like, yeah, I mean, if you were shooting for a 600 calorie deficit and you hit a 250 calorie deficit, you're still in a deficit. If you were hoping to lose, 3 pounds this week, well, that's not a good example, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
You set the goal of what the optimal target is, but like if you're still directionally moving in the right place or way further along than where you started, it is important to kind of take a step back and look at the broader picture and say, it's really hard to call this a failure.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, like I said, I'm talking about this because the excuse I'm using is that I recently hit that weight loss milestone. And so like for my experience with this diet and plenty of diets that had failed in the past, I did previously do what I thought I was supposed to do. I know a reasonable amount about nutrition. I could calculate like what my protein target should be. How many carbs I needed to support the training I was doing, the rest coming from fat. It was plenty of fat to support vitamin absorption, hormone production. I was like, okay, cool. Like I've got my numbers. I did all of this the right way. And now if I'm serious about my results, I just need to stick to them. And, I would do a pretty decent job of sticking to them for a while. And then as soon as motivation started flagging a little bit and I started missing the numbers, I would just start to feel like a failure and just kind of like hit that fuck it point. Whereas like for this attempt, like I still have those same ebbs and flows of motivation, but there's been no motivational collapse.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm losing weight exactly at the rate I'm intending to. Sometimes I'm still heading in the right direction, but at half of my intended rate. Sometimes there's just a lot of shit going on and I don't want to be dieting. I don't want to be in an energy deficit. And I mean, that's coming up. Holidays are coming up. Birthday, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's. Dude, I'm not going to be trying to lose a pound a week through all of that. So just take a break, be in maintenance for a while, and it's okay. And so it's set me up in a position where, I can do a better job of savoring my successes, and it's more a matter of just kind of qualitatively assessing, was this a big win? Was this a small win? Or, if I do go way over my targets one day, it's a learning experience, like one day it's impossible for one day to be that big of a setback unless I allow it to be a setback and snowball, just adopting more flexible restraint has been huge. So that first one went longer than I expected it to, but I thought that was a good conversation.
Yeah.
Moving on, though, this one will absolutely be short because it more or less restates your segment from the last episode of the podcast where you were talking about protein intake targets. So the second bit of advice that I think might be generally good advice in a vacuum, but that sometimes can do more harm than good when just applied as a blanket statement, is giving people or telling people that they should select like quite high protein targets. So like I said, for an in-depth discussion of this, dear audience, refer to the previous episode. But yeah, with high protein targets, for bodybuilders, it can make a lot of sense. Like taking a better safe than sorry approach to protein intake, because protein intake is very important for maintaining muscle mass in an energy deficit. And it gets more and more important the leaner and leaner someone gets. If you're going from, 40% body fat to 35% body fat at a, reasonable rate of weight loss, you got a resistance training stimulus in there, you don't have to worry about losing muscle. When you're taking off the last 5 pounds before a show and going from 8% to 5% body fat, then you probably do need to worry about it quite a bit more. And, again, the whole point of the sport is to be as muscular as possible and as lean as possible. And so if you can, if eating a little bit more protein can help you maintain an additional half pound of muscle over the course of a diet, that could be the difference in placing at a show. So it makes more sense to kind of give people better safe than sorry type protein targets. And for most people, there just aren't those same sets of concerns. So like we talked about in the last episode, well, I say we, like Eric talked about in the last episode, the difference between a protein target of like 1.2, 1.3 grams per kilogram and say 2.2 grams per kilogram or above just doesn't seem to be particularly large or particularly, we don't super consistently observe that there even is a difference to begin with in the literature. Like if you start getting down to a gram per kilo or below, like that certainly seems like it will probably have deleterious effects for the amount of muscle you'll maintain if you're in a deficit, the amount of muscle you'll gain in a surplus. But, it seems like pretty moderate protein intakes probably get the job done pretty well for most people most of the time. Previously, again, I used to just use that old heuristic of a gram per pound, just 2.2 grams per kilo. And I really found that just didn't work for me. One of the big considerations here, again, with just like a successful diet is you need to be able to stick with it. And it also needs to accommodate the rest of your life, and it needs to set you up for success at the end of a diet. And I found that, when I was trying to get more than a gram per pound of protein, that basically necessitated a lot of chicken breast, a lot of protein shakes, and just like a lot of foods that I didn't particularly like. And like I have it easier than a lot of people do because like I'm an omnivore. Like it's going to be harder for a vegetarian or a vegan. And like, I also just don't have that many social things I do. But if you're going out with friends a lot to restaurants and whatnot, having a lot of meals with family, and you're trying to get in a gram per pound of protein with a lot of food options that are like fattier, higher carb, then the choices you'll have to make to hit that protein target will probably be reasonably incompatible with actually staying in an energy deficit in the first place, and will often require kind of trade-offs and choices that lock you into a diet that you probably won't want to stick with for the next 50 years. It seemed like you wanted to say something.
I was just kind of smiling because I've heard of anecdotes where people will be like in bodybuilding prep and they'll be like, I want to go out to eat with the family, but I have to, this is especially people who set really, really, really high protein targets. And they're like, so I went to this restaurant and I said, boil me 2 chicken breasts and then steam me some vegetables. And if I even smell butter near those vegetables, I will walk back into the kitchen. Mm-hmm. Like they just create this like special order and they spend like $30 on the absolute shittiest dinner they've ever eaten. So when you were talking about how like a lot of times people do kind of feel like they're pushed into this situation, even outside of a restaurant scenario where they're like, okay, it's the end of the day or close to the end. I feel completely satiated. I'm fine. I don't feel like eating, but I've only had 1.4 grams per kilogram of protein per day. And therefore, in order to hit my protein target, I'm going to have another meal just to check that box. And in that meal, to make that protein palatable, I'm going to also bring in additional carbohydrate and fat. And it can get to the situation where it's like, that was ultimately, if the goal was fat loss, you probably didn't even really need that extra bump to get you above 1.4 that day. And you just invited all these other calories that just chipped away at your deficit for no good reason.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, you ultimately do need to consume enough protein. Like, not trying to state that protein intake is completely unimportant. But I do think a lot of people, myself included, find that somewhat lower protein targets are just more compatible with the way that they want to eat and the way that they can see themselves eating for the rest of their lives. Not most people don't want to live on a diet of protein shakes and boneless, skinless chicken breasts and broccoli in perpetuity.
Yeah.
And I mean, also, man, with inflation being what it is, a lot of protein-rich foods are kind of expensive. So if money's tight, dropping down from 2.2 to 1.4, like there might be some non-trivial cost savings associated with that as well.
Well, no, I mean, you always hear, like, especially like in the US, you hear college-aged folks who are trying to build muscle, and they're like, yeah, I'm trying to bulk, but it's so expensive. The vast majority of that expense is their protein.
Yeah.
The vast majority.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, like my issue with this bit of advice isn't necessarily the advice itself in a vacuum. My issue is more with how it's often like framed and messaged. So, for example, I think that saying something like, as long as you're getting in about 1.2, 1.3 grams per kilo, you're fine, but aiming for 1.6 may not be a bad idea if it's feasible for you. I think that's perfectly fine. That seems to be in keeping with the evidence. It's not setting 1.6 grams per kilo as a rigid and flexible target you have to shoot for. But if 1.6 or above is in keeping with someone's preferences, it's I'm sure they don't lose anything by getting up that high. Whereas the way I often see it framed is just, you got to get in 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo, and bad things will happen if you don't. And I do think that the advice about protein, when framed that way, has the potential to do more harm than good.
Yeah, I think that's totally accurate. And one of the things that made me smile is, like, you had mentioned, like, a moderate protein intake. But what's kind of convenient is that this, like, 1.2 gram per kilogram general area, like, a lot of Americans end up there unintentionally.
Yeah.
Like, if you read the public health literature, sometimes you'll get, like, these really panicky papers that say Americans are overeating protein and it's a huge problem. And it's like, oh yeah, we found that they're eating like 1.2. So a lot of people who are embarking on a diet might be at the kind of tail end of this range, just based on their dietary preferences alone, and they might not have to really make any major changes to get into that 1.2 range.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so moving on, the fourth bit of advice that I think makes a ton of sense for bodybuilders, which is where a lot of this stuff originates, but may not be the best just kind of blanket advice for people to give or receive, is the advice that I see commonly in a lot of circles, that if you're trying to set up a diet to lose weight, one of the things that you should really try to prioritize is eating basically as bland of foods as you can stomach. And so for bodybuilders, that kind of makes sense. So the thinking behind this bit of advice is that human energy intake is regulated by a lot of different things, but specifically for feeding behavior or eating behavior, you have hedonic and non-hedonic eating. And non-hedonic eating seems to be, in large part, just kind of your body integrating a lot of signals related to fuel availability, satiety, long-term energy status, etc., and trying to like tune your appetite to consume enough calories for survival. But then, we humans, we're not just we're not just basically amoebas responding to just cues from our environment about how much we need to eat to survive. We also have food science and a lot of delicious ingredients and highly processed foods that taste very good that you want to eat in large quantities. And I'm sure everyone listening to this has eaten more than they really wanted to at some point just because the food was delicious. And that is hedonic eating. And so if all of the food you eat in your diet doesn't really trigger that hedonic response, that can help cut down on hedonic eating and large deviations from your dietary goals and targets. And I think that is the sort of thing that can be quite important for bodybuilders as they're trying to get very lean. Because I think just from talking to people who've been there, your brain can kind of get in a state where you haven't eaten much that's really tasted good in a long time. And when something very yummy is put in front of you, a lot of people, even if they generally have a pretty normal relationship with food otherwise, just kind of just attack highly palatable, very hedonic food like a feral animal when they're super, super lean. So that's it makes sense for that population.
It gets different.
Yeah.
There's a great paper. If I remember, I'll try to link it in the show notes. But it's about the participants in the Minnesota starvation experiment, and it really does get different when you start getting really, really lean. If you read that paper, they don't say, "Oh, when they got lean, boy, did they sure get hungry." It's psychosis. I mean, it is psychological. Things are different. In that study, they were okay, if you want to chew gum just to kind of have something in your mouth and a little bit of flavor, go for it. And then they were eating just dozens of packs of gum a day, and they're okay, you can't do the gum anymore, right? Yeah. They would find that people were just kind of so fixated on food and just kind of obsessing over thinking about I've heard anecdotes of bodybuilders who aggregate and collect cooking supplies and recipes that they know they can't use for the next 4 months. There are really pathological, psychological kind of changes that can happen. In the vast majority of cases, they are transient and acute, and then once you kind of get back into the swing of things, they go away. But there's for bodybuilders, there is an application of this, because you will find that when you're in that kind of semi-starvation state and you have a level of food fixation that's very atypical for you, and you kind of open the floodgates by having, I guess I'll have a bite of that. You can't really put that back in.
Yeah.
Once it's out of the bag, stuff has a tendency to go kind of haywire.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other very important thing to note is, again, with bodybuilders, you're talking about a time-limited diet. You're really going to cinch things down really tight for a period of months to get in insane condition for a show, and that's it. Then you go back to eating other stuff. But again, if the goal is to lose weight and keep it off long term, that's not really what you're doing. You're trying to build skills that you can transfer to the rest of your life. And so I think that I think that this advice can make sense if it's not taken to the extreme. So a lot of people run into trouble with over consuming like hyper palatable foods and a ton of just really, really highly processed refined foods. So I'm certainly not saying your goal when you're trying to lose weight and keep it off is try to figure out how you can be in an energy deficit while consuming the maximum number of Pop-Tarts possible. That's certainly not what I'm saying. But I think that the value of pursuing blandness of food for its own sake probably isn't a great thing to pursue for a couple reasons. One is that for most people, that's just going to harm adherence with your diet. We live in a world with a lot of food options and a lot of really yummy food options. And if you're a bodybuilder and you're, you need to get on stage in Speedos in 3 months and look a certain way when that's like you need to look a certain way on a certain date. I think that helps a lot with adherence, like, because you don't want to make a fool of yourself in front of your peers in the sport. But I mean, for a lot of folks, if you say like, hey, I'm just going to have the most bland food possible in my house all the time, and that's the only thing that I'm going to eat on my diet, and then you stop in a gas station and see the snacks, you need to go to the store, you drive by a restaurant, walk by a restaurant, whatever, and there are just so many other much more delicious food options there, and you don't have the same sort of like extreme external pressure forcing you to adhere to your diet, then you're going to find adherence is just more challenging, because everything else that is very easily available for you to eat just tastes better than what you're trying to force yourself to eat. This is also going to conflict a lot with social situations. So if you get in the mindset that I can only adhere to my diet and not go off the rails if I'm only eating bland food, then like if you find yourself in a social situation where you like quote unquote have to eat more palatable food, like that might fuck with your head a little bit, make it easier to kind of go off the rails. And then lastly, like again, a big theme here is the process of losing weight should be a learning process for developing the skills that will transfer to the rest of your life. And I mean, I don't think most people want to live on chicken breast and rice for 50 years, So there is kind of a process you have to go through of whatever food you find, like, not hyper processed, not hyper palatable, but tastes good. Like it's good, palatable food that you enjoy eating. Like you need to be able to consume that in moderation and find something you can stick to, So the fixation on just like only eating bland foods and just the blandest stuff that you can stomach, I don't think sets most people up for long-term success.
Yeah, and there's one kind of assumption that is usually tied to that recommendation, which is like, okay, you are doing a bodybuilding style diet, which means that we assume that the calorie intake and macro intake is fixed, right? And so then it just becomes, well, should I try to eat really, really tasty stuff to hit that fixed set of macros, or some kind of more bland stuff? And the thought process is generally like, well, when you're eating the really hyper palatable stuff, you're still eating the same amount, but it's just going to be a tragedy when the meal ends. You're going to be like, I don't want to stop. It's like, well, why put yourself through that? Just eat some stuff that's a little bit more boring. You're hitting the same macros anyway. It'll just make your life a little less painful for this short-term kind of diet. But when people try to use this advice in a scenario where macros are not fixed, they're not going to get on stage in 12 weeks. So they're like, sometimes you'll see people who say, you know what, I'm afraid that if I eat that cookie, I'm going to eat 300 calories or 400 calories worth of cookies. So I'm going to keep to the bland chicken breast and broccoli and rice. And what they'll do is they'll eat a serving of that, and it clearly didn't scratch the itch that they were going for with that kind of hedonic feeding urge.
Yeah.
And they say, well, maybe if I just eat more of this bland stuff, it'll scratch that itch. And it usually doesn't. And so like one of two situations is actually pretty common when food intake is not rigidly fixed as it would be for bodybuilders, which is either in order to avoid the 400 calorie cookie splurge, you eat 400 calories worth of this other stuff. And in terms of energy balance, you end up in the same place.
Yeah.
The other is instead of to try to avoid that 400 calorie cookie splurge, you eat like 300 calories worth of the boring stuff and then say, that didn't really work. I'm going to have the damn cookies anyway. And then it becomes additive rather than replacing. So sometimes people will think I can basically tune out my hedonic urge to eat by really leaning into eating stuff that will satisfy satiety signals. And they're not completely separate, but they are different. They're distinct.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people think that, well, if I just get full or nearly full, I won't have this hedonic urge to eat anymore. And that rarely seems to be the case. So in scenarios where calories aren't fixed, it's not just that this advice isn't as useful. It can actually sometimes directly backfire in terms of just the sheer amount of energy intake.
Oh, absolutely. And then, so the final thing I have on this list of advice that I think is sometimes good in a vacuum. In this case, I think it's advice that really is just good for bodybuilders, and really isn't that good in a vacuum otherwise, but certainly isn't helpful for most people, is a focus on the outcome of a diet rather than the process of a diet, and particularly kind of time-based and time-limited outcome goals. And I think that a lot of times this isn't directly stated, but it's kind of tacitly implied by the sort of content people put out and the sort of advice that people give, even if they're not like explicitly saying to focus on these things. So, in terms of focusing on outcomes, this is a very visually driven industry. Like people who talk about physique stuff, people who talk about nutrition, like there's this saying like your body is your business card, which should it be? I don't know, maybe not, but I mean, it is. That's that if you're a professional in this field, and you have a much better physique than most of your peers, that's probably going to help your bottom line. And so it makes sense to put that front and center. But what does that tacitly communicate to your audience? Like it tacitly communicates like looking this way is valuable and this is what you should want. Like you should try to be focusing on this outcome. Also, just in terms of how people sell their services, like before and afters are huge, which again makes sense. Like people like to see someone who looks similar to them before, and then 4 months later they have a physique that they would kill for. So, but again, before and afters without further context, that is just a focus on the outcome of a diet, not necessarily the process. And then it's still pretty common to see people who are doing like general health and fitness coaching with a nutrition component, do challenges where it's like, hey, I'm putting together a group and we're all going to try to lose 20 pounds in 6 weeks or whatever, which again, that is a focus on a time-based outcome. And I think a lot of this for bodybuilders makes all the sense in the world. That is literally the sport. You start your diet on a certain day, your show is on a certain day, you got to look a certain way by that day. Like the outcome, the physique itself, that is your sport, and doing it in a fixed amount of time, that is what the sport entails. But I don't think that is really helpful advice to trickle down to virtually anyone else. The time it does make sense is if someone's a strength athlete and they're trying to like cut to the next lowest weight class, because then it's sort of the same deal. You need to be below a certain body weight on a certain date for weighing in. But otherwise, like, yeah, no, that's just not that's not helpful. So I do think that it might be a little bit useful on the front end because people want what they want and they want it now. They don't want to. If you tell someone like, hey, you can have the physique you want in 4 months, or we're going to focus on the process, maybe you get there in 4 months, maybe you get there in 2 years. Just as a sales pitch, we're going to get there in 4 months is way more appealing. But then once you actually get into it, it circles back to a lot of the things we've been talking about to this point. Like if you're trying to lose X amount of weight in X weeks, and you fall behind and you really have a rigid end date, now you have created for yourself a potential vector for failure where one doesn't need to exist. Like if it's more of an open-ended thing, you're just trying to lose weight, you're focusing on the process of building the skills necessary to stay in an energy deficit, do it in a way that's feasible and sustainable for you, building the skills to maintain that weight loss at the end of a diet. Maybe you fall a little bit behind schedule, so to speak, but you're learning a lot through that entire process. And with a process orientation rather than a outcome orientation, it gives you just more just room and grace, I suppose, to build those skills and to interpret setbacks and falling behind schedule and all of that stuff less as a failure, less as an indication that you are likely to fall short of your goal of achieving a certain look or a certain amount of weight loss by a particular date or in a certain period of time. And it's easier to reframe those as learning opportunities. Like if you had some strategies that had been working well for you to stay in an energy deficit, everything seemed pretty feasible. And then just for a week, the wheels fall off. You're finding it really, really challenging to stick to your dietary targets. You have a ton of cravings, energy's low, diet's just really going poorly. You can either step back and say, oh no, like I'm trying to reach this goal in 12 weeks. And instead of moving forward for a week, I've moved back for a week. So now I'm functionally trying to reach the same goal I had before, but only in 10 weeks because I just took a step back. And this week was already so hard. Like I'm already regressing. So like now I have to be even more aggressive to get where I'm trying to go on a certain date. And it like that's not a recipe for success. Like it's no wonder why people lose their motivation when they have that mindset if they hit any speed bumps whatsoever. And I mean, newsflash, you're going to hit speed bumps. But if it's more of like a process-oriented thing, you're not quite as focused on the outcome, certainly not in a time-limited space, you can step back and say, hey, this week was shit. Why did this happen? Maybe some of the strategies that had been working up to this point are becoming less effective. Maybe it's just other stuff going on in my life and I need to give myself some grace and get out of a deficit, be in maintenance for a while. Like I don't need one more stressor in my life right now. Everything else is crazy. But I can take the lessons I've learned to this point, and once things calm down, use all of that to get back on track. It's just not a helpful orientation, just the extreme time-based, outcome-focused approach to weight loss.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is that, some people have asked us why the default behavior and macro factor is, so for example, if you go 400 calories over your target on Monday, why doesn't the app pull that out of Tuesday, or maybe pull it out of like Tuesday and Wednesday? And if you want, you can make the app behave that way. There's a way to do it, but it's not the default behavior. And it's exactly because of what you said. It's like in most cases, when you had a target and you went well above it, that means that there might have been some challenge leading into that discrepancy between target and observed intake. And the last thing we need to do is say, how it was so hard to hit this target yesterday that you went 400 above it? Guess what? That challenge might still be present, but it's going to be even harder because now, in the presence of this slip up, we're going to tighten the screws even more.
Yeah.
And it's not just that we're going to get back on the horse, but we're actually shifting the targets downward to make it even harder to get there. And like you said, if you get really locked into that short time scale, outcome focused, time dependent goal, you start to put yourself in a situation where it can become immensely overwhelming and stressful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's the same thing with how like goal progression works in macro factor as well. Like, when you set a goal, the app tells you essentially like, hey, if you stick to this rate of weight loss or weight gain, but we're talking about weight loss in this segment. If you stick to this precise rate of weight loss, this is the date at which you'll reach your goal. And I think some users expect us to like enforce that end date rather than the updates to be informative. Like, hey, to continue losing weight at the rate you want to, this is what you should aim for. And they'll say like, hey, I was trying to lose 20 pounds in 10 weeks, and I'm 5 weeks in, and I've only lost 6 pounds, and the app isn't dropping my calories really low to try to get me there by what I thought my end date would be. And it's kind of the same deal, if like diets get harder the longer you do them, and if it has been like if it was already a challenge to lose 10 pounds in the first 5 weeks, like if you already fell behind that timeline, odds are pretty low that we could increase the target rate of weight loss by 50% and still get you to 20 pounds in 10 weeks. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, ultimately we want success to snowball, but we want to be able to put the brakes on setbacks before they can snowball into like true robust failures.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that a really outcome-focused, time-based approach to weight loss inverts that. Where, if you're rewarded for anything, like getting ahead of schedule, that involves eating even less than your targets, losing more weight quicker, and you're functionally rewarded for being extra restrictive. And then if you fall behind again because you were like, it's just fucking hard to stay in a consistent energy deficit. If you find that challenging on the front end of a diet, if you then make the diet even harder as you go along, like you're putting people in aggregate in a scenario where you can't get that far ahead. It's hard to feel that good about the success that you're achieving. But boy, if you fall behind, instead of putting the brakes on those deviations and small failures, like they can really snowball into just full on motivational collapse.
Yeah.
So yeah, really the point I'm trying to make in broad strokes with this segment is that I think a lot of the advice that is given in the fitness industry from well-informed, well-intentioned people tacitly has kind of the underlying assumption that food has little value for its own sake, that you'll always be able to stick to your diet, and that you're aiming to get as lean as humans are capable of getting. So in essence, the advice, kind of the tacit underlying assumption is if you perfectly execute on all of these things, you will get diced. And really the optimal body composition outcome is the only thing that matters. And therefore, this is good advice that you should follow. And if those assumptions are true, then yeah, it's good advice that you should follow. But that is not how most folks are. Food does have value beyond the physique it can help you achieve. It tastes good. There's social value to it, cultural value to it. The assumption that everyone will always perfectly stick to their diet, that is quantifiably a bad assumption. So it's less about saying, hey, I'm going to assume everyone listening to this advice is robots, and with that assumption, I will tell them how to perfectly achieve their physique goals. Those aren't the people in your audience, like it is more about helping people develop strategies to do good enough for long enough to get where they're trying to go and then be able to sustain it. So I think for most people, the stakes and ultimate goals of a diet are different than they are for bodybuilders and bodybuilding prep coaches. And quote unquote good enough is good enough. And the real goal is that you're aiming to build skills that will help you maintain weight loss, and you're aiming to find a style of eating that you would be happy to stick with for the rest of your life. And so I think that's the lens as a consumer of information that you should view advice through. Something that might be excellent advice if you could do it for the rest of your life might also be advice that you just have no interest in implementing for the rest of your life. And if that's the case, it's probably not advice that you want to implement while attempting to lose weight, because ultimately you're going to have to drop that and do something else once you lose the weight, and now it's time to maintain that weight loss. So I think it's generally a better approach to focus on those things and build those skills along the way, instead of separating kind of diet life from post-diet maintenance life. Like it's a process of finding something that once you get out of the diet, you're perfectly happy to eat the exact same way you were during the diet, or very, very similar, with the sole exception of, hey, now you can eat a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is great advice. The one thing I would add to it, which I assume that you would agree with, is, we've talked in recent weeks a lot about inter-individual variation and response variability. And the underlying premise of those conversations is that different people are, in fact, different people.
Yeah,
and they will respond to things a little bit differently. And I know that just from observations, like you and I have very different dieting experiences.
Yeah.
The way that we approach it, the things that help us succeed are quite different. And so I would say that for the vast majority of people, what you're saying here is going to lead them in a better direction than just the kind of standard approach, which is, let me take bodybuilding advice and apply it to a much different weight loss scenario. But I would encourage people, if some of these things based on your experience have helped you, that's okay. You don't have to work your way toward the norm if you have past experience or you've experimented with some things and found, I kind of respond differently than most folks. So like, for example, I've tried to do really laid back approaches to dieting, and I struggle with them because I've done a lot of reflecting on this, because I look at the literature that says exactly what you're saying. Exactly. And I'm like, but it doesn't match my reality. Yeah. And I've done a lot of reflecting on that. And I think what I've come to find is that perhaps because of my dieting history, if I take a really relaxed approach to weight loss dieting, it doesn't get into the sweet spot of goal setting where it's challenging enough to excite me.
Yeah.
And so it's not that I get demotivated by falling short of the goal. It's that I get demotivated because the goal is not yet exciting enough to me. It's not challenging enough to get my foot in the door and to get rolling with it.
Yeah.
And so like some people might find things like that, or some people might find, for me, in the way that I eat, I'm just really sensitive to hyper palatable foods, even if I'm not absolutely shredded. And so for me, it's best to kind of keep things at no more than like a 7 out of 10 on that like hyper palatability scale. Some people might find like high protein. Maybe for you, hedonic eating is not a challenge during your dieting process, but satiety is something you really struggle with. And you find that maybe even going above 2.2 grams per kilogram helps you. I think
or it could just meet your food preferences better.
Exactly. Yeah.
Some people just really, really love a ton of very lean, protein-rich foods. I don't know how. Makes no sense to me, but those people exist, and I'm certainly not going to tell them they're wrong for that preference.
Yeah. So I just wanted to, in the interest of being fully comprehensive, I wanted to leave that door cracked for people so that they feel encouraged to experience their own experiences and actually utilize that information. I think whether it's training or nutrition or some of the psychological elements of interventions, it is important to lean on your own experiences and take them seriously.
I agree. And just to add two things. One, like to just reiterate something I said up top, but to make it very clear, a lot of this stuff is good advice in a vacuum, but becomes unhelpful advice if it leads to issues with implementation. But if you've tried, like if you've taken some of this advice on board, implemented it, and it didn't lead to issues with implementation and sticking with it long term, then it is great advice in a vacuum, and it's great advice for you. You know, like you said, it matches your experience, works well for you. The other thing I'll say is that with a lot of your experiences, like that you noted, some of the things you found for yourself that seem to comport better with some of this advice and seem to conflict a little bit with the literature. I wonder if it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario where the people for whom bodybuilding advice, like bodybuilding type nutrition advice, works well and matches well with their psychology, doesn't lead to issues with implementation and adherence. I wonder if those people are just the folks who are disproportionately likely to become bodybuilders in the first place.
I was thinking about that when I was like, well, I don't know. Some of this stuff has been really like because I have intentionally said, no, I'm going to be more compatible with the literature and take a more chill approach to my next diet. And I just can't get into it. So yeah, I do think that to some extent, bodybuilding is an innate, stable trait of a human being, rather than it is a hobby or pursuit. Like I do think that there are some of those traits that are fairly stable and persistent in me that nudge me towards certain approaches to dieting.
Yeah, I think sports as a whole select for different types of people. You know, like to be a power lifter, there's a certain level of psychosis you need to have to get very far in the sport, because I'm sure I'm going to make some people upset by saying this, but there are inherent risks and dangers associated with the sport that aren't inherent to all forms of general resistance training. Like catastrophic things can happen when you have 700 pounds on your back. They're unlikely to happen. They generally don't happen. But when you walk that weight out, like, you feel it. You know that if something goes astray, my life could irrevocably change in this moment for the worse.
Well, yeah, and like, you know, like an equipped bench presser.
Yeah.
Many of them are very familiar with what it feels like when your radius and ulna are bending.
Start flexing, yeah.
That's an unusual thing.
Yeah, and so the sport selects for a type of person who isn't just comfortable with those things, but who likes those things, which is atypical. And so I think that bodybuilding is similar. Like, I think it selects for people with like particular personality types and particular relationships with food, their own bodies, like satiety cues and signals, all of that stuff that probably in aggregate differs from population norms to a pretty large extent.
Yeah.
Which further, just on a fundamental level, calls into question the utility of, you know, just normal folks trying to lose 10, 20, 30 pounds and keep it off, taking advice that bodybuilders have developed and found to be very effective for themselves and other bodybuilders.
Yeah, it definitely reinforces that point. And I think, you know, your segment does a good job of saying, like, here is the bodybuilding toolkit.
Yeah.
And here is the not bodybuilding toolkit. And what I would, and I'm sure you would encourage people to do, is give yourself access to all the tools, right? So like a lot of the people who are really into this kind of bodybuilding oriented advice say, no, that other stuff doesn't work. That's not serious enough to work. And then people who embrace these other sets of approaches might say, oh, that bodybuilding stuff, way too rigid. It'll never work for anybody. The ideal scenario is grow your toolkit. Mm-hmm. You know, figure out what's going to work for you, but don't feel like just because you're losing weight or you want to lose weight, that all of a sudden you're locked into the lifestyle of a bodybuilder in 1985 with a fanny pack and the white and black pants. They need to bring those pants back.
They need to bring, actually fanny packs are coming back.
Yeah, but I hear people are wearing them like around their shoulder.
Yeah.
That's not the same.
It's not a fanny pack anymore.
It's not.
Yeah.